continue with chapter 3, which was Oneness, a Black Model of Psychological Functioning, on the section that begins the nature of psychological functioning. The proposed paradigm provides a theory of human nature in that it accomplishes three things. One, makes claims about the universe as a whole. Two, describes the essential nature of the individual human being. And three, offers a diagnosis of what is basically wrong with humankind. The universe is at once spiritual and material. The material being the slower moving outward appearance of energy. The human being is an individualized expression of infinite spirit, influenced by an interaction of the energies within which it exists, of which it is comprised, and which it generates. Our basic difficulty is that humankind does not know its true nature or the divinely ordered of which it is a part. The Afrocentric paradigm fits into the category of a higher force psychology, as called for by Maslow. It is transpersonal, transhuman, and centered in the cosmos. At the same time, it comes virtually full circle to the initial ancient approach to the study of being. From the Egyptians, the Greeks seem to have learned of the deification process that would ensure everlasting peace and happiness. Psyche, from the Greek, means spirit, breath, principle of life, soul, or mind. Logos means reason, that is the controlling principle of the universe or divine wisdom manifest in the creation, government, and redemption of the world. Psyche and logos are combined in psychology. Afrocentric psychology, or the Black model of psychological functioning, is based on the study of the principle of life, or based on a particular kind of reason, the unity that contains and transcends all opposites. Reason, or divine wisdom, manifest in the creation, government, and redemption of the world, is the controlling principle of the universe. The paradigm follows from that tradition. This paradigm follows from that tradition within which psychology was concerned with the study of the soul, immaterial essence, animating principle, or actuating cause of individual life. The paradigm assumes, I am so sorry, I'm going to have to start over. I know that noise is in the background. I'll start over in this paragraph. Go ahead. Go ahead and finish. I'm sorry, I don't know when that noise started, but I certainly heard it, so I'm sure you picked it up as well. Afrocentric psychology, or the Black model of psychological functioning, is based on the study of the principle of life, or based on a particular kind of reason. That is the reason which is the unity that contains and transcends all opposites. Reason, or divine wisdom, manifest in the creation, government, and redemption of the world, is the controlling principle of the universe. The paradigm that follows from that tradition, within which psychology was concerned with the study of the soul, immaterial essence, animating principle, or actuating cause of an individual life, is the psychological paradigm we're pursuing now. The paradigm assumes an optimal worldview, a holistic Afrocentric approach to knowledge, not limiting itself to the segmenting confines of a materialist worldview. All is one. Capra notes that fragmentation is inherent in the assumption of a material reality. According to Fromm, Prior to Freud, humankind had ceased to believe that the power of reason could establish the validity of norms and ideas for human conduct. As a means of discovering truth and the essence of phenomena, reason was relinquished to intellectual or a mere instrument to manipulate things in humankind. Freud, a student of African culture, showed that reason is the most valuable and specifically human power. Yet reason is subject to distorting effects of passions, and only the understanding of one's passions, with that understanding can one free reason to function in a proper fashion. The Black model of psychological functioning is consistent with Freud's view, except in its accounts of man and woman and nature's derivation and control of passions. It is understood there is reason and the potential of control. Our paradigm follows a tradition of Afrocentricity, which never lost faith in the power of reason or the innate goodness of humankind. In the Afrocentric paradigm, normalcy assumes health and well-being. To be normal is to see ourselves and the world as manifestations of infinite spirit. From a conception of self as inseparable from infinite spirit, our worth is intrinsic in being. Our purpose then is to bring into greater awareness our nature as infinite spirit. In the Afrocentric paradigm, normalcy assumes health and well-being. To be normal is to see ourselves and the world as manifestations of infinite spirit. From a conception of self as inseparable from infinite spirit, our worth is intrinsic in being. Our purpose then is to bring into even greater awareness our nature as infinite spirit. Because we are defined as spirit as that which is known in an extrasensory fashion or transphysical, there are at least three terms, God, consciousness, and energy, that can be used interchangeably to describe spirit. In their strictest interpretation, all fit our definition of spirit, without connotations of specific dogma or organized religion and church. With the materialist ontology of a segmented worldview, it has, until now, been difficult to introduce the concept of spirit or God in a non-religious context. Within the framework of the Afrocentric paradigm, however, such a non-religious, religious, or sacred, secular distinction lose their meaning because nothing from capitalism to genetic engineering exists apart from some belief system or religion of some form or fashion. And two, nothing exists of which spirit is not a part. God is a term that symbolizes a supreme or ultimate reality, one infinite spirit. By the same token, consciousness is used to symbolize infinite spirit. All that exists in consciousness. According to Adams, consciousness may be defined as all categories of experiencing, processing, knowing, and analyzing perception, cognition, intuition, instinct, and emotion at all levels or domains, including those commonly termed conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. No specific psychological or physiological mechanisms are presumed in particular. Any restriction or neurological brain function, any restriction on neurological brain function alone would contradict and delimit the metaphor. In varying forms, everyone is a manifestation of infinite energy. My choice of terminology is related to the unfoldment in history of the principles of the Afrocentric paradigm, which offers the cultural frame of reference needed to take consciousness or realization of the spiritual realm to a higher level. Ancient Africans spoke of the deification of man and woman or union with God as the basis for their educational system. As we have already discussed the etymology of the term psychology, let us consider that logos is also defined and identified with the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, or Christ. Christ means anointed one who has elevated his or her consciousness into union with the divine. Graves identifies at least 16 crucified saviors before Jesus the Christ. The first of recorded history is Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris, or Herod, the son of Asar and Aset, the same people. Horus, Isis, and Osiris. Jesus the Christ studied in the Egyptian mystery system, and when interpreted from the perspective of their culture, the teachings of Christ provide specific instruction for the deification process. Using the Afrocentric paradigm as a framework for interpretation, Christ's teachings are an accessible vehicle of instruction in the model of psychological functioning. They create a blueprint for everlasting peace and happiness similar to the teachings of other great prophets, Muhammad, Buddha, Krishna, Hurley, and others. The problems of humankind are derived from a segmented worldview through which we see ourselves as separate from God. Yet, we are not separate. We are told in him we live, move, and have our being. In John 17:21 through 23, we learn of Christ's prayer or affirmation for his followers, that they may be one, as thou, Father, art in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may know that thou hast sent me, and the glory which thou gavest me, and have given them, that they may be one, even as we are one, I in them, thou in me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that thou hast sent me, thou hast loved them as thou hast loved me. All is God, that is. Anything that is not God is illusion, and in time will dissipate. God is all supply, health, power, life, good, peace, love, the source of all good. To be separate from God is to be separate from these in their fullness. Evil is that which is not God, a creation of humankind seeing himself as separate from God and giving power to the negative illusion of its own creation. Evil is illusion. It has no power except the power we give it by believing in it. Sin is seeing ourselves as separate from God and focusing on the knowledge of good and evil, God and not God. This is the meaning of being born in sin, that is, into human consciousness, which has claimed knowledge of good and evil. As we sin, we cast ourselves into hell, a negative, unhappy state of mind. It is existence, our experience of separateness from God. It is an existence permeated by evil, oriented toward materiality, ending in death. When we enter the idea that we are separate from God or spirit, we invite duality into our reality, that is good and evil. Prior to the creation of the separate self, all is one, God manifesting. When the separate self is created, we must, in order to define reality, rely on information provided by the five senses. We have already learned that the five senses can inform us of only appearances. Even this is based on previous programming and prior beliefs. From the perspective of an optimal conceptual system, we say that the alienated, separate self functions in the realm of illusion, that is, false reality characterized by its temporal nature. A material five-sense reality is, by definition, limited and finite. It places us in constant struggle with our environment to possess and control those materials we perceive to be necessary for our sustenance. And our worth is based on the amount of our possession and the measure of our control. On these external criteria, identity is under continual threat. From a sense of self as separate from God come false desires for material things believed to be the substance of survival. To fulfill these desires, we create false activities, getting caught up in the stress and the rat race on the treadmill, and false problems of limitation and scarcity. With false problems comes false suffering, feelings of hopelessness and depression. The whole process is one of seeking peace and finding none. In this context, falseness does not mean that a person's experience of the material construct of reality is not exactly what he or she believes. Falseness refers to the temporal illusory nature of the suboptimal reality that is constructed when a people's or person's mode of perception and belief is fragmented, fractured, or segmented. The principles of the Black model of psychological functioning require that we move from the most inward to the most outward. We must eliminate false identity, that is, seeing ourselves as separate from God, the divine consciousness, and supreme reality. We can accomplish this by assigning truth to the notion that we are one with the source of all good, as opposed to existing as isolated individual ego, personalities, and forms. Giving power to the illusion is an error. Error is the misconception or misperception of superficial material appearance as substance and allows for discord and disorder. As we expand our awareness, we shall see that there is no error in truth. We must control, that is, exercise control over our thoughts. We must recognize the power of words, for words label experience and thus give form to thoughts. Language, word usage, reflects the accumulated wisdom of a people. Language is created by selecting from an infinite store of sensory experiences what, through repetition of experience, is believed to be most useful. Experiences that remain unlabeled as the sensory input level do not become part of language and do not typically enter consciousness. Experiences that remain unlabeled at the sensory input level do not become a part of language and do not typically enter consciousness. That bears repeating. We access the meaning of language or word usage by some set of images, feelings, or sounds. Since for the most part, our language is already set, we must exert control in terms of the meanings, images, feelings, and sounds we use to access language and create thoughts. Here we must learn to see with a single eye. In other words, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, and of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Philippians 4th chapter, 8th verse. In keeping our thoughts filled with the realization that all is God appearing, we see with a single eye and come to live by faith or positive beliefs, rather than by fear, negative beliefs. As this perspective is maintained in our consciousness, we can become fearless observers of whatever passes through the theater of our minds. Thus, our perceptions are monitored in a systematically constructive fashion. Remember, it is not what we see that is illusion or error, but the sense we make of it. That is the determining factor, the sense or meanings that we make of that which appears. The moment consciousness has existence, it has existence as something, as forms of reality. I would say it has existence as an idea and later a belief. Power is the ability to define reality and structure belief. Within this ultimate power, all falls into its proper place or order. We need to fully comprehend and utilize this power in a positive fashion in order to restore order to our lives, to the cosmos. The understanding of an optimal worldview is imperative. While each of us has the same amount of power, many of us give our power up by choice or through ignorance of its nature. No one can make us think or feel what we do not choose to think or feel. When, for example, a person professes that power is money or political influence, and we have neither, we respond by feeling powerless. We actually give that person our power, for we are never powerless unless we give our power up. Research has shown that any thought that is very repetitious, strong, full of powerful emotion, and a sense of absolute certainty, it will wear a groove in our brain. An individual's thinking can become stuck in the grooves. Radioactive tracers that detect what happens in the brain show that every idea or feeling creates a radical distribution of blood in the brain. If the blood flows in a certain pattern all of the time, more cells will grow there. Fewer cells grow elsewhere, thus the grooving. Also, over long periods of time, synapses become fixed with strong thoughts, and thoughts produce a certain brain structure that is rather set, though not impossible to change. In an alpha state of consciousness, that is a state of relaxation, our bodies believe what we visualize to be reality. Visualization therapy is used in treating illness in various forms of meditation that engage mind over matter are founded on this principle. We turn off alpha by exerting any form of mental effort, such as solving a problem, by invoking mental imagery. As we learn to give our minds over to an optimal worldview, a perpetual alpha-like state may develop. Over time, we see that positive thoughts directly give form to positive experience. As the ancients understood, we are specifically instructed not to worry or take thought for life, what we shall eat, drink, or wear. Two disciples report this dictum in the teachings of Jesus the Christ, Matthew 6:25-34 and Luke 12:22-32. In addition, we are told that God knows we have needs and will provide them if we seek first the kingdom of God, that is, realize our oneness by elevating our awareness through an optimal conceptual system to that which is supremely good. These ideas will become clear within the paradigm as we explore the nature of consciousness and the role of words, thoughts, and positive belief or faith. In Hebrews 11th chapter, verses 1-4, we are taught that faith, positive belief, is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Evidence can also be interpreted as expectation of things not seen. Through such faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the creative wisdom of a supreme intelligence and divine love, and that ultimately, in reality, that which will be seen is far greater than that which now appears. We'll next move on to part 2, avoiding nihilism in favor of growth, in our next session.
All right, Linda, certainly it's good to see you again and to continue our dialogue in optimal psychology. I think we need to spend a little time in terms of the sort of definition of psychology, because one of the directions in which you're going is sort of the spiritual nature of how we get to know ourselves, or at least one pathway. And we need to know how the mind relates to that. And how do you define psychology anyway? In terms of either a Western sense or an African sense?
Sure, that's a great question. So as we know from the Western sense, we have the psyche, which initially was the soul, and logos, which has been distilled to the study of. But in actuality, the logos is referring to that consciousness again that has aspired and developed to a conscious union. So psychology from a Western sense has been distilled down to mean a study of human behavior. Psychology from an African-centered perspective has been expanded based on the cultural tradition of wisdom to be illumination of the soul, helping people come into fuller realization of who they are as human beings, what it means to be human, what the purpose is as a part of humanity, and really supporting people toward that understanding and elevation.
I just want to, stop you there a little bit, Linda, because I think that's sort of excellent, because I think at some point we went over the question of, well, how is it that the Greeks were exposed to the mystery teachings, which we can call it that, although I don't like to call them mystery teachings because it's not so much a mystery. It should be.
It was a mystery to them.
What we do every day, when it has been described by others as mystery teachings. It's just wisdom teachings, really. So I think one of the questions that you had earlier on was, how is it that the Greeks were not able to understand the wisdom teachings of our ancestors? Because obviously they went there to learn, and we described, how many of them, we not named how many of them had been there to learn, and all of their young people, really, those who were bright and inquisitive, went there to learn. Some came back with some knowledge, and then it seems that the knowledge was either not completely absorbed or misunderstood and misinterpreted. And I think we come back to that in terms of answering the question of definition of psychology, because in terms of the Western sense, psychology has come to mean really the functioning of mind as an entity which is sort of rational and responds in relationship to our sensory perceptions. And I think, as you were saying, from the African perspective, it is really about who we are, understanding who we are as human beings and how we relate to our environment. And I think that is so critical, because if you look again at how our wisdom teachings have been interpreted and what they've considered our theology, speaking about the multiplicity of our gods. And it has nothing to do with gods per se, but it has to do with nature. And our wisdom teachings, and we need to become consistent over time, which we're not being consistent now, but our wisdom teachings are our understanding of nature, who we are as natural human beings, and the nature that surrounds us, the environment. And if you look at the hieroglyphics and everything else within that society, everything was symbolic of function, of natural function. And that's where we get natures from, and that's where we get nature from. And the one nature Neteru, who is the supernature, so to speak, or the source of all nature. And then the natures are functions, and so our wisdom teachings are an accretion, shall we say, of the knowledge of nature over time. And that's what the civilization represented, this deep knowledge of self and nature. And, and I'm going to throw this back at you in a minute, because the stories that were told relative to our understanding of nature and ourselves, there were allegorical tales that had to do with actual deep understanding of ourselves. And of course they call these myths, but they were allegorical tales that carried a meaning beyond the story. And then what happened was that when the Western mind came on that, they interpreted a lot of that historically. And certainly if the allegorical tales were illustrated by nature, both in terms of animals as well as in terms of the astronomical situation, meaning the sun, the moon,
cosmology, yes.
Yes, and so that the theology, if you will, was mixed up with the seasons and the astronomy of the time. And this was totally misunderstood.
Still misunderstood, unfortunately. And they're still struggling to try to understand. And I think that's why optimal psychology is so important, is because coming from that wisdom tradition, we're able to marry the rational and the intuitive. They're not separate, so that as I come to elevate my own consciousness, my rationality expands and blends with an intuition that either affirms or disconfirms my direction and my movement. And so there's so much that we still possess as keepers of the wisdom tradition that has still evaded Western people, Western culture, and most definitely Western psychology. Interestingly, the good news is, though, Western psychologists are bit by bit coming to realize their inability.
But, I think that is true, that there's been a lot of tendency in that direction. But, the approach is still ultimately using the rational mind to try to understand. And it's a knowledge base, or it's a knowledge, based on an accumulation of what people think and what people say. And also in terms of what the individual thinks relative to what other people think and say. So you have a whole lot of words and you have a whole lot of rationality. And we get down to the bump, so to speak, because at some point, as you were saying, the rational mind, which deals with things and facts and people, etc., you have to leave the rational mind and that type of knowledge and go to intuitive wisdom. And actually, when we're talking about intuitive wisdom, we're talking about consciousness.
Yes.
When we're talking about consciousness now, and we go back and we understand that consciousness is not an epiphenomenon of matter. Matter is an epiphenomenon of consciousness.
The reverse is true, yes.
I think we touched on a little bit last time. But then we get down to the whole business of quantum physics and the link then between, quote, science and the mystical experience, as you have described it. Again, there is a jumping off point, because quantum physics, again, I think we touched on it a little bit the last time. It takes you down to beyond particles. As you know, Einstein took us to energy equals MC squared, the business of matter and energy being somewhat interchangeable. But the quantum physics took us down to the level that you can't really determine what's there, in a sense, beyond matter. because consciousness interferes with it. So what's down there must be consciousness. So they're at the level, the limit of where you can go using mechanical equipment and the mind, mental thinking to understand, quote, physical reality. Because when you get down to understanding physical reality, the source is not physical, it's metaphysical.
Absolutely.
And they don't have instruments, and then the mindset is not a metaphysical mindset.
That is so true.
So they're still missing the big picture.
Totally, totally. And what's interesting too, Dr. Garvey, is that the logic
Yes.
that would be needed to get to the intuitive mind won't get them there. They're still stuck in that dichotomous logic. Either it's this or it's that. When the physics has clearly said it's both this and that at the same time, depending on your perspective. So even the logic, the reason of the wisdom tradition has always been both and.
Yes, yes.
And as our reasoning gets to be, but how is it both this and that? How are both true at the same time, even though they appear to be polar opposites and totally incongruent? But as our consciousness elevates and our capacity for reasoning develops based upon the diunital logic that allows us to see both sides and ultimately realize the unity. Without that, we won't get there. They won't get there. But the most important thing is that we as human beings, the mothers and fathers of all human culture and civilization, get there and remember what it is that we once knew.
Yeah, there are two things I wanted to touch on there as the business, as you call it, diunital logic, meaning the oneness. And it's a fundamental truism that nothing is created as one. Everything is created as two. In other words, all of the manifestations, obviously it comes out of oneness, true, but all of the manifestations are dual, meaning you cannot talk about short unless you talk about long. You cannot talk about hot unless you talk about cold, because one is obviously measurement and the other one is obviously temperature. So they're joined, you see, and our understanding, because we understand it derives from oneness. We understand that oneness manifests as, you might say, but the purpose of our awareness and understanding is that you can't separate them out into two separate entities. It's the same thing when you talk about black and white. You can't separate out even black and white because they're all color, and you can't have one without the other. And you can't have light without dark, and you can go on and on through all of these things. You can't have dry without wet. I mentioned hot and cold, and so on. You can't have inside without outside, or outside without inside. And you can't come without going. And so everything is dual in its manifestation. But you have to understand that the duality is a oneness. It derives from a oneness, and the Buddhists call this the middle way, the middle path. You see, and of course we talk about it as ma'at, the harmony and the balance between entities.
Yes.
So that we don't go to extremes. We're always in the middle, because we know that there's no such thing as bad without good, and we're somewhere in between the good and the bad, usually. Or even if we describe it as good, we're describing it as good because we know what bad is.
There's only one way to even conceive of good, is at least, if not bad, not quite as good. We have to have some variation. Without variation, there's no knowing, and there's no language to assign that knowing. So that's an essential feature of consciousness and human nature that is so dismissed and misunderstood, but it's so foundational to our capacity to develop and to grow. Even life's processes, they say in order to elevate our consciousness, we must have some struggle. We must have some challenges. I always tell people, well, you can't be a master unless you've mastered something. And in order to master something, there's some challenge, something you need to aspire to working through. But that's hard to comprehend by many people because they don't understand, again, the unitologic logic and the principle of duality, as Jehudi said.
Mm-hmm. And you know, and that's also the meaning of life and the purpose of life is to grow into that awareness and that knowledge and that wisdom that allows you then to be, as you described it, a master. And of course, we're really talking about mastery of yourself.
Yeah, self-mastery.
And it's not so much mastery of the environment, but it's mastery of how you respond to the environment, because that's what it's all about. Nobody guarantees you that you're not going to have obstacles. That's not what life is all about. You know, if you look at nature, there's going to be a rainy season and there's going to be a dry season and there may be drought. You know, and the soil may be sandy, et cetera, et cetera. So there are always going to be obstacles, or there are always going to be difficulties. But the thing is, how do you respond to these obstacles? There's an optimal way, and I love that word, Linda, which you've used so intelligently. There's always an optimal way to respond, meaning you don't get caught up in whatever the manifestation is per se as an entity, but you look at the broad picture and the circumstances, and then the depth of your own knowledge that you bring to that set of circumstances so that you can deal with that appropriately. You know, you don't just bring your baggage, you know, 10 years ago, learn behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, that gets us into the whole business of the essence of psychology, if you will, because everything is mind.
Yes.
And each of us lives or projects a particular mindset onto the world. And each of us lives pretty much in our own universe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and truth be told, that because of our culture, many of our universes are somewhat similar. But if we go too much outside of the overall cultural universe, as we know, we're punished. But each of us does have a universe, and that is a mental universe that we project onto what we see. So very few of us actually see reality as it is.
Absolutely true.
That's your job, so to speak, in terms of optimal psychology. How do you transform our mental universe? Because, you know, many of us are brought up in a culture, and let's deal now with the culture that we're brought up in. You know, even just looking at aesthetics, because that's one of the easy things to look at. You know, where, you know, straight hair, blonde hair is supposed to be of value. You know, lack of melanin is supposedly of value. Thin nostrils or thin or absent lips is supposedly of value. How do you deal with that psychologically as somebody who does not fit, quote, that norm,
Mm-hmm.
which is a norm that is a Caucasian norm in terms of its
Origins.
That's their value in terms of their aesthetic, but that's not our aesthetic.
Not at all.
Because we have a different physical basis for our aesthetic, but we're forced into that aesthetic, and of course we know all of the aberrations that we create in order to deal with that. We straighten our hair, and we lighten our skin. You know, and we give value to those who have lighter skin, etc.
Yeah.
We do plastic surgery on our nose and whatever. So how do we deal with that, Linda? Especially living in an environment that, let's say, where we are a minority population in a majority culture that doesn't value our aesthetics.
You know, that's such an important question, because now we're seeing with younger generations the impact of so-called desegregation. And what happens to our children when we send them to the captors of our ancestors to be educated?
Mhm.
They will be miseducated. So earlier on, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, so I clearly remember the civil rights movement, and I clearly remember how horribly Black people were treated when they were so determined to bring justice and try to make America what it claimed it was supposed to be.
Mhm.
And so for me, I had the blessing of being at the zeitgeist of movement toward truth and justice. And the 80s, 90s kids didn't have that, don't have that. And by the same token, if you grow up in an environment where other people who look like you have internalized racism or internalized oppression or internalized the worldview and mindset of our ancestors' captors, then there's no way they can get out of that trap of a European Caucasian beauty standard, because the society is structured so that your own sense of identity and worth can be based on how you look. Now, I was blessed to be raised in a family where I was told I was beautiful. So from the beginning. So when I went, and I grew up in an all-white environment. So when I went to school, whatever white people thought, it made no difference to me. I remember very clearly one time a little girl, we rode the bus to school, we lived on a farm, and a little girl on the bus called me a nigger. And I didn't know what a nigger was, but I knew by the way she said it wasn't very nice or anything I wanted to be. So when I went home and I asked my mom, what's a nigger? She said, well, when people are unhappy and don't feel good about themselves, they try to say things that will make you feel bad about yourself, but you don't allow them to do that. You know, they're already feeling bad. You go on feeling good. Mm-hmm. That was the best advice I could have ever gotten, because that's my standard. Nothing's wrong with me, something's wrong with you, because I see that negative energy you're trying to project. And I think that's something that we haven't passed on to our children effectively enough, because they're absorbing all this insanity as though it's not insanity, and all this immorality and injustice like it's normal and should be accepted. So we have our work cut out for us, Dr. Garvey.
Well, I think as you're saying, Linda, the situation in some sense has gotten worse, because back in the 60s, I think our communities were stronger. We were trying to develop them, and we had more of a sense of identity and unity. Because again, that was a period where we were developing the Afro and, Black is beautiful, Black power, and those concepts of Black consciousness coming up again, as they did in the 20s and 30s with the new Negro. I think we're doing that again in the 60s. But I think since then, it hasn't surfaced again in that sense of subsequent generations, I think because of the continued onslaught, because our heroes of that time have been destroyed. The Marcus Garvey, the Malcolm X, the Martin Luther King, those heroes have been destroyed. So, the whole big propaganda machine, the CBS and the NBC and the ABC or whatever else, and your news media. And of course, we have these instruments, cell phones or whatever you want to call it. And there's an onslaught of all of this, which is essentially negative propaganda, because all of it validates white supremacy. Yeah. And what that means is that it gives no value to us as a non-white people. So the young people have this onslaught. And of course, then again, our schools are, quotes, integrated, and I think integration is an illusion, is an illusion and a delusion of acceptance. It's not acceptance at all. All that has happened is that our independence as a people, which was growing, has been destroyed, because many of our so-called leaders, who weren't true leaders, led us in the direction of this integration. where we lost our Black teachers, our Black schools, and so on.
Mhm.
And, all of that home training, you could not discipline your kid because the psychologist now told us that you couldn't do that. It destroyed, the young people's minds or something, when the opposite is true. You have to set limits. But anyway, so much of this has happened that I think is essentially destructive of family, and it's also destructive of individual growth in terms of your own, character and humanity. So this has been the onslaught, and the young people don't really then have these parameters and the directions in which to grow. The church has been devalued to a large extent. I don't think the church is growing. I think a lot of people have been leaving the church, and we need to get to that too, in terms of the theology. How does that help us, or how does that hurt us in terms of the optimal psychology? And just go straight into this, because how do you separate psychology from spirituality?
It makes no sense. Obviously, you can. And I think the subjective nature of perception and the human experience has kind of been distorted. And this whole notion of objectification is being pushed, like there's something out there that should be determining. But you know what's so interesting to me, Dr. Garvey, during the 60s and 70s, our health statistics were the best they've ever been when we were fighting for liberation. Since that time, every indicator has gotten worse. So the health benefits of resistance and perseverance and standing for what's true and just and righteous is tremendous. And I guess the part that keeps me so hopeful, despite the onslaught of racism and internalized racism, is that no matter what they do, there are still those young people among us who just come with it. I remember several years ago, the kids, they would say, I watched their language, it's so important. And they would say things like, it's all good. Where'd that come from? Oh, we talk about the epigenetic memory of trauma. That's the epigenetic memory of triumph. Amidst all this insanity, how did these young people come up in the very environments we're talking about with the conclusion it's all good? No matter what's happening, it's all good. So I think there's that spiritual aspect that we still have to look to and trust and call upon, because our young people, irrespective of their missocialization, also have access to that realization. But they need our support and our direction and the clarification of who they are, where we are, where they are, where we all are, and what time it is. So I think about a time I spoke to a group of young people, hip hop rapper type, and they were talking about how angry they were at their parents' generation because they'd been lied to. And on the one hand, I was happy to hear that they understood they'd been lied to, but I was also not wanting that anger and that rage. So when it was my turn to speak, I said, I'm not sure if your parents intentionally lied to you or if they did the best they could do or knew to do at the time. Because each generation has different challenges. My mother could not have foreseen what my challenges would be, nor more so than I could have necessarily foreseen the details of my son's challenges or my grandchildren. So, but what we are able to do is embrace a human beingness that allows an appreciation and an acceptance of whatever those challenges are, and teach our children to touch and tap into that being becoming, that being that they are, which is Netter, divine spirit, supreme being, whatever language, God, goddess, becoming in conscious and fullest realization of who it is, why they're here, and what they're here to accomplish. And I think we can keep that message going. I hear bits of it among the younger generations, and they certainly seem eager, many of them, But again, as the young people were challenging the older generations at my conference, some older generations did kind of push the myth of meritocracy, the myth of if you just work hard, you too can be president. No, you can't. You too can. And then as a consequence, younger people think, or they're told to think, well, you just go within the system, work hard enough, and you'll make it. But what are you making? Where are you making it to? That's the part that we really have to clarify.
I think that's so important, Linda, because I think that's exactly what has happened. It's been, shall we say, a giving into the system, meaning that we have, shall we say, admitted the triumph of the system because of the extent of indoctrination and propaganda, and because of so many our exit strategies have not worked, have been defeated. And the current generations coming after the 60s, et cetera, have then sought to fit in. And this has been the integrationist model, shall we say, in terms of functioning within the society. That there's the carrot and the stick. Well, if you work harder, even though there is, quotes, prejudice, you can still make it. Look, so and so made it. The spook at the door, so to speak. You too can become president. Well, what did that change?
Exactly.
You too can rise in the corporate ladder. How will that change the corporation? It won't. You too can be on the Supreme Court. How will that change what the Supreme Court does? If you have a different opinion, then you're the one person with a different opinion. So, people have adopted the system. And again, it goes back, to Carter G. Woodson and others. Again, my father's generation, the miseducation of the Negro. In that, if you're educated in the same values and of the system that incarcerated you, that enslaved you, then your mind will be destroyed or captured, and then you'll go to the back door because the education assures that that's where you'll go, and if there's no back door, as you
You'll create one.
You'll create a back door, because those are the limitations, the blinkers that have been put on your mind by the system, and that the same system that incarcerated you, same system that enslaved you, the same system that colonized you, the same system that lynched you and has oppressed you over time, 500 years. So many of our young people are striving to make it within a system that doesn't value them. And I think as we go down the road, I think we have to go back to a definition of the suboptimal system based on the suboptimal psychology. To make it plain, as Brother Malcolm would say, to our young people, that this is not a system that you want to join. It's based on individualism. It's a system based on greed. It's a system based on exploitation. It's based on oppression. It's a very, very inhumane system. And you can trace that through the history of at least the last 500 years, if not the last.
Absolutely.
The last 2,000 years. So why would you want to join that system that has done you wrong? You end up doing yourself wrong. All of this, I think, needs to be unpacked.
It has
so
to.
That the young people can really see it, in real time, because they don't get it from their cell phones. They don't get it from school. As critical race theory now is a challenge. That business of critical race theory.
Well, it's so sad, because I think what happens is our because we've bought into that suboptimal socialization and bought into individualism, materialism, competition, and exceptionalism, that's the way to go, and elitism and classism, all of those things, we're force-fed 24/7, 365. We're bound to get some of it on us unless we're also teaching people to think critically and question and think deeply about what is really going on here and who is it serving, who is benefiting. Mm-hmm. I'm always astounded when people say, oh, I've achieved some modicum of success and I am my ancestors' dream. I wonder if that's what they were dreaming, because that's not true. Yeah. If you're not standing for what's true, just, righteous, for the greater good of the whole, considering the least among us, if you're not doing that in your lofty position, then you're not your ancestors' dream. You're your ancestors' nightmare. But that kind of thing is something that we don't often say. We just say, oh, yay. No, you've missed the point. You've missed the boat, because the wisdom tradition isn't about acquiring objects or dividing people because of looks or income or position or education or where you got it or how much you got. The wisdom tradition says, we need your heart to balance the feather of truth when weighed on the scale of truth. And if you can manage that through all of this, then you're guaranteed eternal life.
And I think that, the key point there too is that the wisdom tradition is not about the individual. It's about every man. It's the every man philosophy. And this takes us to, in a sense, well, not in a sense, it takes us to Christianity, which we've been force-fed with in some way, because that was brought to us as, quotes, the religion. And, that brings us straight up against this idea that someone else, some God, could have come down and taken away all our sins and died for our sins. And somehow, all we have to do really is to pray to that person who was half God, half man, or to his Father up in heaven somewhere, and then things would be made right. Now, obviously, that's a caricature of the whole thing. But I think that's something of the essence, meaning that I think that this particular religion or this particular interpretation of this religion has destroyed the meaning of religion and has taken it out of the reality of its origin. Because no religion can be about an individual. It has to be about a technique or an ability to solve the problems, if you will, of all people. It can't be about just one group of people or one individual. And we have religions that have come down to us through Old Testament and New Testament about either one group of people or an individual who's going to save us. And we have been stuck with this. And I think we have to unpack this, because both those religions came out of the wisdom tradition.
They did.
It started. They did. And they are, how should I say, unsatisfactory interpretation of the wisdom tradition. And we need to be able to unpack that for, those of us who are today, so many of us are Christians, or Black Jews, or Hebrews, etc. And even it doesn't matter whether we're Muslims, because that's part of this tradition, shall we say, the Judeo-Christian, the Muslim tradition that has dominated the Western experience and the African experience, as coming outside of Africa, coming into Africa, and in some way, transforming our spiritual traditions that went back to the source and the original wisdom tradition. And I would argue that, a number of our preachers, there have been some attempts, valid attempts at the Black theology, shall we say, to deal with the misinterpretations that exist within Christianity. I don't want to say white Christianity, but within Christianity as it has come down to us. And I think this is very, very much needed, because it's important for us to know that there is a tradition that will allow us to free our minds, psychologically, but access our spiritual selves and therefore our oneness with God. And that exists, and that is part of our heritage.
Absolutely. So very true. And I think it's so important that we understand this difference in worldview. What comes to mind, or what came to mind when you were speaking, Dr. Garvey, was, what is it, John 1:17? Jesus' prayer for his disciples or his followers, that they may realize they are one with me as I have realized I'm one with my Father, that we can be one, that we are one. And I would suspect in that vein then, that if you really believe Jesus the Christ's teachings, his prayer for his followers ought to be one that's answered, correct? Based on the premise. But even then, so much of religious doctrine has pushed people away from that realization of oneness, of unity. Even though it's right there, somehow it got through the deletions, but people are not necessarily made aware of that unity with the divine. There's no intermediary needed, but the Western Christianity has had to put a mediator in there, otherwise you couldn't be controlled, and you wouldn't follow what the dictates or the agenda we had in mind. So there's a reason the Pope blessed the first ships to go to the Americas with enslaved African people. There's a reason then we need the Pope, or they needed the Pope to be the supreme person within an organized religious structure. And I think the reality is, and this is not to put down Catholics, I think everybody has a right to their belief system, but we just have to encourage people to question and challenge and look at the big picture, look at it holistically. Because as you pointed out, it's not about the individual as much as it is the collective. And the only way the individual becomes or reflects the collective is if they've elevated their consciousness to realize they're not separate. We talk about Ubuntu. Ubuntu is being, Ubu, into, becoming. Oneness, Ubuntu. Many people now say, I am, we are, therefore I am, therefore we are. And that's a distillation, but the main thrust is our oneness. My very being is connected to your very being. They're inseparable.
It's very interesting if one looks historically at, let's say, Christianity, or maybe you should say almost any religion. Religions developed towards a pyramidal structure where there is a centralized control. And I think this is what happened to Christianity, certainly during the Roman period, when so many, the Council of Nicaea, etc., when so many books, if you will, of the New Testament were thrown out and others were kept in, etc. And the nature of the religion Christianity was changed, because it can be shown that both Christianity and Judaism originated in Egypt. Genesis comes straight out of the wisdom tradition in terms of the waters and so on, the primeval nun, etc.
That's true.
Yeah, and in both of these religions, there is a wisdom tradition. Certainly the Kabbalah in Judaism, and of course there's Christian mysticism, which understands the centrality of the ability to identify with God as an experience. The so-called deification of man is especially true in the Eastern Orthodox Church. So this is there within the religions, although there's this superstructure that is very controlled and very full of dogma and very full of ritual that obscures this, which goes back to, as well as the Hermetic teachings, which have become secular and so on, which goes back to, again, the wisdom tradition. And, on the walls of the temple in Luxor, as you know, which was built, I think, by Amenhotep, I don't remember what, I think the 17th dynasty, but it's there in Luxor on the walls. You can see, the whole Annunciation and the Incarnation and the birth and the adoration of Jesus, and the virgin birth and the adoration of Jesus. So, it's clear, historically, it's clear archaeologically, and so on. And I think our, clergy, I know Dr. Ben Buchanan used to preach a lot on this in terms of, our clergy not having the understanding of the source of the Christian religion. I was going to say our Christian religion, but it's our Christology, our Christology, if you will, because, as you know, Jesus, Eusu, is Horus, which is our hero in terms of the Osar, Oset, and Heru, and the Osirian resurrection, which is the rebirth of our soul, and the journey that Horus makes in terms of his own maturity, and then resurrecting his father, who is Osar. And nobody comes to the Father except through me.
Yeah.
You have to have the same journey as Heru to really become like the Father. I and my Father are one. And it's also beautifully illustrated there. So our wisdom tradition needs to be more known. And there's a lot that needs to be done there, not just in terms of scholarship, because a lot of it is there scholarly, but it needs to be popularized in terms
It
of,
does. It really does.
and our young people need to have access.
Absolutely. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so I so appreciate your having these conversations around this understanding an Afrocentric worldview, introduction to an optimal psychology, because our intention is to provide that knowledge so that we facilitate the salvation of all of humanity.
Absolutely, because I think what we're talking about will, as you say, facilitate the new paradigm. We have to move away, as we can see right now. The old paradigm is again self-destructing there in Ukraine, where I think we can even call it World War III. As you know, we've always been brought into these wars, even though they're between Europeans, both the First World War and the Second World War. I think we can consider this a Third World War, where we see the greed and the power and the acquisition and the wanting to control other people and other people's resources and lands, and to propagate only your way of thinking and behaving to the exclusion of everybody else. We can see that coming, face to face again with another worldview. So I look forward to a lot of changes coming out of this. and a lot of opening up, because despite the enormous propaganda at the present time of how right the West is, I think, as you know, over time, we'll see that, there's no such thing as being totally right. And certainly, the West has caused enough harm and genocide and stealing of land and resources over the last 500 years. So to pretend that we have created some sort of, wonderful, super democracy where everybody is living in harmony is absolutely false. And I think this is going to pull the veil back one more time. But it's important for us to know the truth and to share the truth, to propagate the truth, and to move in that direction, which is absolutely necessary for us in terms of not just survival, but in terms of prosperity. Because of course we can survive within the system, and this is what we've done. But we have to go beyond survival, and we can't just be the spook at the door or the accessory helping Massa to do this or to do that, or helping Mrs. to do this and to do that. We have to be our own selves, and we have to manifest our own destiny, our own humanity. And
Absolutely.
why we were sent here. As you're saying, I think we were sent here as we were sent in the first place, to manifest civilization and to save humanity.
This is so true. And I think as we look at what has happened, even in contemporary times, it has been Black people, African people, who have taken us this far toward a just, sacred, and sustainable world. And I don't see that changing. If it's to happen, it will happen because we have taken our rightful leadership.
I agree. So I look forward to our next session.
Likewise.
Thanks
so very much.
Engaging me in this conversation. Peace and
Yes, and peace and blessings to our listeners.